Hey guys, tonight we are climbing into the most dangerous marriage in English history. A union so hazardous it makes your worst dating app disaster look like a gentle fairy tale ending. Tonight you are becoming one of the wives of Henry VIII, a towering red-bearded increasingly round monarch who collected spouses the way some people collect parking tickets frequently and with absolutely zero remorse. He is charming. He is powerful. He smells faintly of venison and entitlement. And he has a well-dominant habit of solving marital disagreements with an axe. Before we get too cozy, a huge and genuine thank you to the lovely soul who suggested this topic down in the comments. Your ideas are the entire reason this little channel keeps growing. And I really do read every single one. Usually at some ungodly hour with a cup of tea going cold beside me. If you enjoy these late-night wanders through history, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually want to. No pressure whatsoever. And if you would rather drift off with just your ears, we are now on Spotify too, with the link waiting patiently in the description. And if you'd like a little more, membership is already available on the channel, which gives you access to 8 hours of ad-free video to drift off to uninterrupted whenever you like. Now, dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft background hum, fluff your pillow, and tuck your neck in nice and safe, because trust me, you're going to want to keep it. Let us pause for a moment and wonder. Have you ever thought about what it actually felt like to marry the most feared man in the kingdom? Could you smile politely through dinner knowing the woman before you left through the tower and not the front gate? Would you survive the pressure of producing a son when the entire country treated your womb like an overdue group project? Could you hold on to your head literally while surrounded by spies, ambitious in-laws, and a husband whose affection had the shelf life of warm milk? And could you do it all while laced into a corset tight enough to double as a Tudor blood pressure cuff? Well, get comfortable because you are about to find out. Congratulations! You have just woken up in the year 1533 in a cold stone palace that smells of tallow, roasting meat, and ambition. Someone is already lacing you into a gown that weighs more than a small sheep. The king has just noticed you from across a crowded hall, and that, my friend, is the single worst piece of luck a woman could possibly have. Let us begin where every miserable day begins with waking up. You open your eyes in a grand four-poster bed thick with velvet curtains, and for one glorious second you think this is not so bad. Then reality strolls in uninvited. The room is freezing because stone palaces hold cold like a personal grudge. The fire has shrunk to one sad orange wink, and there is already a servant hovering by your pillow, because privacy is a luxury that has not yet been invented for anyone important. Your mattress may be soft, but everything surrounding it is pure politics. Every smile is a transaction. Every servant is a potential informer, and somewhere down a drafty corridor, a very large man is quietly deciding whether he still likes you. Welcome to court. You sit up and immediately the temperature reminds you that central heating is several centuries away. The walls are stone. The floors are stone. The whole building is essentially a beautifully decorated refrigerator. And the tapestries hanging everywhere are not there for charm. They are there to stop the drafts from cutting through you like tiny invisible knives. Even so, the cold finds its way in, curling around your ankles, sneaking under the blankets, treating your royal bedchamber like its personal playground. You could ask for more wood on the fire and someone would fetch it, but that is not really the point. The point is that even the Queen of England spends her mornings shivering slightly and pretending she is not. Then there is the smell. It is not terrible exactly, but it is a lot. There is wood smoke from the fire, tallow from the candles, the faint animal note of the rushes on the floor, And underneath it all the collected fragrance of a large building full of people who bathe roughly as often as a comet appears. Everyone burns herbs and sprinkles perfume to cover it, which means the palace does not smell clean so much as heavily disguised. It is like walking into a room where someone has sprayed air freshener directly onto a problem rather than removing it. You will get used to it. Everyone does. Nose blindness is one of the few genuine mercies of Tudor life. Now let us talk about company, because you have plenty of it whether you want it or not. As queen you are almost never alone. Ladies in waiting sleep nearby. Servants attend you from the moment you wake. And the idea of simply lying in bed for 10 extra minutes in peaceful solitude is frankly laughable. Someone is always in the room watching, listening, ready to help you, and equally ready to report on you. Imagine having a job where you're important enough to have staff, but not important enough to ever close a door. That is your life now. Even your yawns have an audience. And all of this, the cold, the smell, the crowd of watchful faces, is happening while you carry a quiet, constant awareness that your position is not secure. You're not the owner of this palace. You're its most decorated tenant, and the landlord is famously willing to evict people permanently. The women who slept in beds like this before you didn't all leave through the front gate. So you rise, you let them dress you, you smile at the faces around you, and you begin the delicate performance that is every single day at court. You have not even had breakfast yet, and you are already working. Which brings us neatly to the question of how a person ends up in a bed like this in the first place. Now, let us talk about how you ended up here, because nobody wakes up married to Henry VIII by accident. It usually starts with a glance across a banquet hall, the kind of attention most people would kill for. And most of his wives would later die for. Maybe you danced well. Maybe you laughed at the right joke. Maybe you simply had the misfortune of being young, poised, and standing in decent lighting. Whatever it was, the king has noticed you. And being noticed by Henry is a bit like being spotted by a very rich, very unstable weather system. It feels warm and flattering right up until it flattens your entire life. There is no polite way to decline. You've just been promoted, and the promotion may be fatal. Here is the thing about royal attention that nobody tells you until it is far too late. It does not feel like danger at first. It feels like winning. The most powerful man in the kingdom has singled you out from a crowded room full of beautiful, ambitious women. And every instinct you have, plus every relative you own, is screaming that this is the best thing that has ever happened to your family. And in a sense, it is. Favor from the king means influence, wealth, and status raining down on everyone connected to you. The trouble is that royal favor is not a gift. It is a loan, and Henry has a habit of calling loans in rather brutally. You must also understand how young Henry once was in this game, because it colored everything. In his prime, he was genuinely charming, tall, athletic, well-read, and famous across Europe as a golden prince. He wrote music. He jousted. He charmed ambassadors. And he made whoever he focused on feel like the center of the world. So when that attention lands on you, it does not feel like a trap. It feels like being chosen by the sun itself. The problem, which you will discover slowly and then all at once, is that the sun does not care what it burns. Consider the pattern if you can bear to. And Boleyn caught his eye while serving his first wife. Jane Seymour caught his eye while serving in. Catherine Howard caught his eye when he was old, ailing, and desperate to feel young again. In every case, the initial spark was flattering, romantic, even thrilling. And in every case that spark eventually consumed the woman who lit it. Being noticed by Henry was the beginning of a story that almost never ended well, which is a rather grim thing to realize while you're still enjoying the compliments, and you cannot simply opt out, which is the truly claustrophobic part. If a normal suitor pursued you and you are not interested, you could refuse, however awkwardly. But this is not a normal suitor. This is the King of England, head of the church, controller of your family's fortunes, and holder of the power of life and death. Saying no to him is not a personal boundary. It is a political act with consequences that reach far beyond you. So you smile back. You accept the compliment. You let the machinery start turning because stopping it is not an option available to you. In the modern world, unwanted attention from a powerful figure is a scandal. In Tudor, England, it was a career, a curse, and quite possibly a countdown, all bundled into one flattering look across a crowded hall. And once he'd noticed you, the letters began to arrive. So the king wants you, and he is not shy about it. Prepare yourself for the courtship, which in Tudor terms means a barrage of passionate letters, gifts, and increasingly intense attention from a man who is used to getting absolutely everything he asks for. Henry could be genuinely romantic when he wanted to be, penning heartfelt notes and showering his target with jewels and poetry. The problem is that all this affection comes with a very short warranty and a nation watching over your shoulder. Every letter you write back is weighed, examined, and possibly read aloud to advisors. Say too little and you seem cold. Say too much and you seem grasping. It is the most high-stakes texting situation ever devised. Except one wrong message can end with your family disgraced or your head separated from the rest of you. We actually know quite a lot about how Henry wooed because some of his letters to Berlin survive tucked away in the Vatican of all places. In them he pours out longing, frustration, devotion and impatience, sometimes signing with little drawings and declarations of eternal love. Reading them, you would think you were looking at the words of a hopeless romantic, a man utterly undone by love. And perhaps in the moment he was. Henry had a remarkable talent for believing his own feelings completely, right up until the moment he stopped having them. The chase itself could last an astonishingly long time, and famously kept Henry pursuing her for years, refusing to become simply another mistress, and holding out for the far riskier prize of marriage. Imagine the nerve that took. Every day she declined him was a day she gambled her entire future on the hope that his obsession would hold. It is a bit like refusing a billionaire's advances while living in his house, eating at his table, and knowing he could ruin your family with a single word. The longer she held out, the more he wanted her, which is exactly as dangerous as it sounds. And you're never really pursued in private, no matter how personal the letters feel. The whole court is watching. Ambassadors write home about the king's latest infatuation. Rival families track every gift and every whispered conversation, calculating what it means for their own fortunes. Your reputation is dissected daily by people who have never met you and never will. It is the strangest kind of romance, one conducted in front of an audience of thousands, all of whom have opinions and most of whom have agendas. Privacy, that thing you already lost in the bedchamber, is nowhere to be found here either. So you must reply with exquisite care. Encourage him too eagerly, and you look like a schemer chasing a crown which hands ammunition to your enemies. Cool toward him too sharply and you risk wounding the pride of a man whose pride was roughly the size of the kingdom. Every letter is a tightrope walk performed over a very deep drop. You choose your words the way a person diffuses a bomb slowly, carefully, and with the full understanding that a mistake does not just embarrass you. It could destroy everyone you love. The truly unnerving part is knowing how the story tends to go once the chase is won. The passion that burned so hot in these letters had a habit of cooling into suspicion, boredom, and worse. The very intensity that felt so flattering was the same intensity that would later turn against you. But that is a worry for the future. For now you write back. You smile at his gifts, and you pretend, as everyone does, that this fairy tale has a happy ending, and eventually inevitably comes the moment you must actually say yes. Let us address the small matter of consent or the total lack of it. When the King of England decides he is going to marry you, your personal opinion on the arrangement is roughly as relevant as the weather in a country you will never visit. Marriages at this level were about power, alliances, and heirs, not butterflies and candle-lit dinners. Your father is likely thrilled. Your uncles are already calculating how much land they can squeeze out of the deal, and everyone keeps congratulating you as though you've won something rather than being assigned it. You may feel dread pooling in your stomach, and you would be right to, but you smile, you curtsy, and you say yes, because the alternatives range from banishment to something far worse. In Tudor England, saying no to the king was not a boundary. It was a death wish. To understand how little say you have, you must understand how marriages worked for noble women of the time. A young woman of good family was bluntly an asset. Her marriage was a tool used to bind families together, settle debts, secure alliances, and climb the greasy ladder court. Her wishes were a pleasant bonus if they happened to align with the plan, and an irritating obstacle if they did not. This was normal even for ordinary aristocratic marriages. Now scale that all the way up to the crown, and you can see how thoroughly your feelings vanish from the equation. Your own family, far from protecting you, is often the driving force pushing you forward. The Barons and the Seymours and the Howards all understood that a daughter in the king's bed meant power flowing to the whole clan. Ambitious fathers and scheming uncles saw royal marriage as the ultimate investment. And they were not about to let a squeamish girl talk them out of a fortune. So the pressure to say yes did not only come down from the king above. It came sideways too from the people who were supposed to have your best interests at heart and had quietly decided your best interest was their advancement. It is worth sitting for a moment with just how frightening this would feel from the inside. You have watched what happened to the women before you. You know that royal favor is fragile and royal displeasure is lethal. And yet you are being marched smiling toward a union you did not choose with a man whose track record with wives reads like a warning label. Saying yes feels less like accepting a proposal and more like stepping onto a ship you know has sunk several times before, while everyone on the dock waves cheerfully and tells you how lucky you are. And refusing is simply not on the table in any real sense. This was a world where the king's will was tangled up with the will of God himself, especially once Henry made himself head of the church. To defy him was not merely rude. It could be treason. Women who resisted or displeased him tended to find themselves stripped of everything, exiled, imprisoned, or worse. The illusion of choice was maintained with all the pretty rituals of courtship, but everyone in the room knew the truth. There was only ever one acceptable answer. So, you give it. You say yes. You let them plan the ceremony, and you fold your fear neatly beneath your composure, the way you fold your hands for prayer. You've accepted a crown, a husband, and a role, none of which you truly selected. In the modern world, we call a choice made under threat no choice at all. In Tudor England, they called it a wedding. And speaking of the wedding, it is time to walk you toward the altar. It is time for the wedding, which sounds joyful until you remember who the groom is. Your ceremony might be a lavish public spectacle or a quiet, slightly panicked private affair, depending entirely on how legally complicated the king's current situation happens to be. And with Henry, it is always complicated. There may be a previous wife who technically still exists, an angry pope somewhere, and half of Europe writing furious letters. As you take your vows, you're not just marrying a man. You're marrying his politics, his temper, his rotating cast of enemies, and the expectation that you will fix every problem he currently has by producing a son within the year. No pressure. Enjoy the cake because it may be the last uncomplicated thing you get for a very long while. The style of your wedding tells you a great deal about your standing, and not all of it is comforting. Catherine of Aragon married Henry in a grand celebrated union befitting a Spanish princess and a young king. And Boleyn, by contrast, was married in secret, quietly and quickly, because Henry's first marriage was still being untangled, and the whole affair was drenched in scandal. A hushed ceremony behind closed doors is not the romantic secret it might sound like. It is a sign that your marriage is legally shaky, politically explosive, and being rushed through before anyone can stop it. Nothing says lasting love like a wedding that has to be kept quiet. Then there is the tangle of legality surrounding whether you're even properly married at all. Henry's habit of discarding wives created a genuine mess of overlapping claims and disputed annulments. When he married Anne, his union with Catherine had not been cleanly resolved in the eyes of Rome, which is precisely why he ended up breaking with the Pope and rewriting England's entire religious identity. Your wedding, in other words, might come attached to a national schism. Most brides worry about the seating chart. You get to worry about whether your marriage has accidentally started a religious revolution. The guest list, where there is one, is its own quiet battlefield. Every noble in attendance is calculating what your rise means for them. Your family beams because their fortunes have just soared. Rival factions smile thinly while privately sharpening their plans. Foreign ambassadors take careful notes to send back to their masters because a new Queen of England shifts the balance of power across the continent. You stand at the center of it all in a magnificent gown, ostensibly the happiest woman in the room, surrounded by people whose feelings about your happiness range from delight to barely concealed loathing. And looming over the whole event, unspoken but understood by everyone, is the single expectation that will define your entire marriage. You're here to give Henry a son. The vows, the feast, the finery, all of it is really the ceremonial opening of a contract with one crucial clause. Everyone smiling at you is also silently measuring the months until you might announce a pregnancy. It is a wedding, yes, but it is also a job interview, an alliance, and the first day of an impossible assignment, all wrapped in silk and set to music. So you say your vows to a man you may barely know in a ceremony shaped by politics you did not create, surrounded by people watching you with hungry eyes. You smile because you must, and perhaps for a moment you even allow yourself a flicker of hope. It is your wedding day after all. Cherish that flicker because once the music fades and the guests drift away, there remains one more part of the day that the entire kingdom is unaccountably interested in. And that is where we go next. Ah, the wedding night. A private moment shared intimately between you, the king, and quite literally the future of the entire English monarchy. There is nothing romantic about it because everyone from the archbishop to the ambassadors is deeply uncomfortably invested in what happens. Your job, as understood by the whole realm, is to produce a healthy male heir as quickly as humanly possible. Servants will be curious. Courtiers will speculate. Foreign diplomats will actually write home about it. Imagine your most awkward personal moment. Then imagine it being treated as a matter of national security. That is Tuesday night at the palace. And if Henry decides afterward that the spark simply is not there, as he did with at least one very unlucky wife, you may find yourself unmarried again before you have even unpacked. The lack of privacy is the first thing that would astonish a modern mind. Royal marriages were not sealed quietly behind a firmly shut door. There were traditions, sometimes involving the formal blessing of the marriage bed, with attendants and clergy present to sanctify the moment before the couple were left alone. The consummation of a royal marriage was considered a public and political fact, not a private matter, because whether or not it happened could later determine whether the marriage was valid at all. Your most personal moment is in effect a matter of state record. Sleep well. This was not mere nosiness, though there was plenty of that. It was law and legacy tangled together. A marriage that was not consummated could be annulled, and annulments were Henry's favorite escape hatch. So the question of what did or did not happen on any given night carried enormous weight. Years later, lawyers and clergymen might pore over exactly these intimate details to decide whether a queen had ever truly been a wife. Few things are more chilling than knowing your private life may one day be dissected in a courtroom by men in robes. The clearest example of how badly this could go is in of Cleves. Henry took one look at his new bride in person, decided he was not attracted to her, and the marriage was reportedly never consummated at all. This became the very grounds on which it was swiftly annulled. So the wedding night was not simply about romance or even duty. It was about whether your marriage would legally survive the morning. A king who woke up unenthusiastic could unravel the entire union, and there was very little you could do about a verdict rendered on something so unfair and so intimate. And hovering over all of it, as always, is the demand for a son. Every wedding night was, in the eyes of the court, the potential first step toward an heir. The pressure was immediate and immense. There was no easing into married life, no honeymoon period of getting to know one another. The clock started ticking the moment the vows were spoken. A queen who did not become pregnant reasonably soon would begin to attract worried glances and pointed whispers. Your body had become the kingdom's most closely watched project, and the deadline was yesterday. So you endure this strangest of nights. Aware that curiosity presses in from every side, that your worth is being weighed, and that the man beside you holds not only your affection, but your very survival in his restless hands. It is the opposite of intimate, really, a private act loaded with public consequence. And when morning comes, whatever happened or did not, you must rise and step into your new role fully, because there is a crown waiting. And crowns, as you about to learn, are far heavier than they look. Congratulations. You are now Queen of England, which is a bit like being handed the most beautiful, most cursed job in the world. On the surface, it is dazzling. You have jewels, palaces, servants, and more gowns than you could wear in a lifetime, which is convenient given how short those lifetimes tended to be. But the crown is not a reward. It is a spotlight, and it never turns off. Every choice you make is judged. Every friend you keep is scrutinized. And your entire worth is measured against one impossible standard: the ability to give the king a living son. Catherine of Aragon wore this crown for over 20 years and still lost it. You've been wearing it for about 10 minutes. Wear it well and wear it nervously. Let us start with the genuinely lovely parts because there were some. As queen, you command extraordinary luxury. Your wardrobe is stuffed with velvets, silks, and cloth of gold. Jewels are yours in quantities that would make a magpie faint. You have estates, an income, a household of servants attending to your every need, and a status that places you above nearly everyone in the realm. If material comfort were all that mattered, you would be the envy of the world. And in fairness, plenty of women did envy you right up until they saw the bill. Because the crown came with a spotlight of merciless intensity. Everything a queen did was observed and interpreted. How you dressed, who you spoke to, how you behaved in chapel, whether you smiled at the wrong ambassador, all of it was noted and discussed. You represented not just yourself, but the king's honor and the dignity of England, which meant there was no such thing as an off day. A private person could be moody in peace. A queen who seemed out of sorts risked setting off a wave of speculation about what it might mean. You were always performing, and the reviews were always being written. Your worth, meanwhile, was tied to a single achievement that lay almost entirely outside your control. A queen was expected to secure the succession by producing a healthy son. This was the true measure by which Henry and the court and the nation judged you. Your intelligence, your kindness, your loyalty, and your political skill were all pleasant extras. The son was the point, and the cruelty of it was that whether you conceived a boy was a matter of biology and luck that no amount of virtue or effort could guarantee. You were being graded on an exam whose answers were sealed inside fate itself. Look at Catherine of Aragon and let the lesson sink in. She was a king's daughter, a devout and dignified queen, beloved by the people, and married to Henry for more than 2 decades. By every standard of character, she was a triumph, and still she lost the crown, cast aside because she had not given him a surviving son. If 2 decades of loyalty and virtue could not save the first queen, then no queen who followed could ever feel truly safe. The crown did not sit on your head so much as balanced there, ready to fall the moment your usefulness came into question. So you accept the jewels and the palaces and the bows, and you understand quietly that none of it is really yours. It is lent to you in exchange for a service you may or may not be able to deliver. You're the most exalted woman in England and simultaneously one of the most precarious. It is a strange, glittering, anxious existence. And it begins each morning appropriately enough with the elaborate ordeal of simply getting dressed, which is a battle all its own. Let us talk about getting dressed, because being a queen means being sewn into your own outfit like a very expensive parcel. Forget throwing on something comfortable. Your gown involves a stiffened bodice, layers upon layers of heavy fabric, sleeves that could smuggle a small dog, and a corset laced so tightly by your attendants that breathing becomes more of a suggestion than a function. It takes multiple people and a good chunk of the morning just to make you presentable. You cannot dress yourself. You cannot easily sit, and bending over is a genuine engineering challenge. It is beautiful. It is regal, and it is quietly torturous. By the end of the day, you will have learned that royal elegance is really just discomfort wearing very good jewelry. Consider the sheer number of layers involved. You begin with a linen shift against the skin, the one garment that is regularly washed, and therefore your only defense against a full day of noble grime. Over that goes a stiffened undergarment to shape the torso, then the kirt, then the gown itself, then over sleeves, then perhaps a French hood weighed down with jewels. Each layer is heavy, and together they add up to an outfit that can weigh a startling amount. You are not so much wearing clothing as carrying a small tent that has been decorated by the finest craftsmen in Europe. The shaping garments deserve special mention because they were the instruments of your daily suffering. Bodices were stiffened with wood reeds or later whalebone to force the torso into the fashionable rigid flat-fronted shape. This was not designed for comfort or for breathing or for the radical notion of moving freely. It was designed to make you look correct. And correct meant upright, still and elegant to the point of immobility. You could not slouch even if you wanted to because the garment simply would not permit it. Your posture was quite literally built into your clothes. You also could not dress yourself, and that is not an exaggeration. The lacing was done up the back. The layers required careful arrangement, and the whole assembly demanded several pairs of hands. Your ladies-in-waiting would spend a significant part of the morning constructing you piece by piece, like reverent builders erecting a very ornate scaffold. This meant that even the simple act of getting ready involved an audience and a team. Once again, that precious thing called privacy was nowhere to be found, not even between you and your own undergarments. Now imagine trying to actually live in this. Sitting down was an operation. Kneeling for prayer, which you did often, was a careful negotiation with your own outfit. Eating gracefully while encased in stiffened fabric took practice. Warmth at least was one small benefit, since all those layers did an excellent job of keeping out the palace chill. But the trade-off was that you spent your days in a garment that restricted your movement, compressed your ribs, and reminded you with every breath that beauty at this level was a form of endurance. Modern shapewear is uncomfortable for an evening. This was your entire waking life. And the truly humbling part is that you did it every single day without complaint. Because to appear less than perfectly dressed would itself have been a scandal. A queen in plain or careless clothing sent a message, and never a good one. So you submitted to the ritual. You let them lace you in. You carried your magnificent burden with a serene expression that gave no hint of the quiet ache underneath. You looked like a vision. You felt like a beautifully upholstered prisoner. And once you were finally dressed, there was still the matter of your face, which came with its own special brand of danger. Now that you're dressed, you must be beautiful, and Tudor beauty is a dangerous business. The fashionable look demands skin as pale and smooth as porcelain, which noble women achieved by slathering their faces in a mixture that often contained white lead. Yes, lead, the substance we now keep firmly away from humans. It gave a lovely ghostly glow while slowly poisoning you, damaging your skin, and requiring even more of itself to cover the damage it had caused. It is a beauty routine and a slow-motion tragedy rolled into one. Add plucked hairlines, reddened lips, and hours of maintenance, and you begin to understand that looking like a proper queen was a full-time job that could actively shorten your life. Beauty, it turns out, was quite literally to die for. The obsession with pale skin was really an obsession with class. A fair, untouched complexion signaled that you did not labor outdoors like a common field worker, that you were a lady of leisure whose face had never known the indignity of honest sunshine. Tanned skin meant work, and work meant low birth. So noble women went to considerable and dangerous lengths to appear as pale as possible, treating a bit of color in the cheeks as something to be hidden rather than admired. The whiter and more untouched you looked, the more clearly you announced that you were far too important to ever do anything useful. The most notorious method involved a cosmetic that mixed white lead with vinegar, producing a smooth, pale coating for the face. It worked beautifully in the short term and catastrophically over time. Lead is toxic, and applying it directly to the skin day after day led to skin damage, discoloration, and a whole cascade of health problems. The truly diabolical part was the cycle it created. The lead ruined your complexion, which meant you needed even more of it to cover the ruin, which caused further damage, which demanded still more cover. It was a beauty routine that fed on the very destruction it caused, like a snake elegantly devouring its own face. Beyond the poisonous foundation, there were other fashions that seem baffling now. A high forehead was considered elegant, so women plucked their hair back and thinned their eyebrows into near non-existence, aiming for a broad, smooth brow. Lips and cheeks might be reigned, sometimes with substances that were themselves not exactly gentle on the body. The overall effect, when complete, was a pale, high-browed, red-lipped vision of aristocratic refinement, achieved through a combination of discomfort, expense, and quiet chemical harm. All of this took time, of course, which was the point. Maintaining the correct appearance was a daily ritual requiring servants, ingredients, and patience. Beauty was not something you simply possessed. It was something you manufactured every morning through effort and applied it like armor before facing the watching court. And because appearance carried such weight, a queen could not opt out. To appear plain or unpolished would be read as carelessness, and carelessness in a queen invited unflattering interpretations about her health, her spirits, or her hold on the king's affection. So you sit patiently while they build your face layer by toxic layer, and you tell yourself it is worth it, because in this world, how you looked genuinely mattered to your survival. A queen who remained beautiful and desirable kept the king's wandering eye at home, at least in theory. A queen who lost her looks lost one of her few defenses. It was a grim calculation, trading your long-term health for short-term security in a court where the long-term was never guaranteed anyway. You are radiant, you are pale, you are poisoned, and you are ready. Now, after all that, surely you at least get to be clean. About that, surely you think a queen at least gets to be clean. Let us gently lower those expectations. Bathing was infrequent and complicated, involving servants hauling and heating water for a wooden tub, and there was a lingering belief that too much washing could let sickness into the body. Instead, you freshen up by changing your linen shift, dabbing on perfumes and scented oils, and simply hoping for the best. Everyone around you is doing the same, so the entire court exists in a rich layered cloud of perfume, sweat, and whatever the kitchens are burning. Your teeth, meanwhile, are quietly rotting thanks to all that fashionable sugar, giving your radiant royal smile a distinctly brownish tint. You're the most important woman in England, and you smell like a very expensive candle set on fire in a barn. The practical difficulty of a proper bath cannot be overstated. There were no taps, no plumbing, feeding hot water to a convenient tub. Every bath meant servants fetching water, heating it over fires, and hauling it bucket by bucket to fill a wooden tub, which then had to be lined with cloth to spare your skin from splinters. It was labor-intensive, time-consuming, and a genuine production every single time. Even for a queen with servants to spare, a full immersion bath was an occasional event rather than a daily habit. It simply was not the effortless refreshment we take for granted today. On top of the sheer inconvenience sat a genuine medical fear. Many people of the era believed that water, especially warm water, could open the pores and allow disease to seep into the body. Since deadly outbreaks swept through regularly and no one understood how illness actually spread, this belief was not lunacy so much as a wrong guess made in the dark. But it meant that frequent full bathing was often actively discouraged as risky. Cleanliness, as we understand it, was viewed with a certain suspicion, which is not a sentence you expect to write about the people at the top of society. So, how did anyone stay even remotely fresh? The answer was linen. The white shift worn against the skin was believed to absorb the body's sweat and dirt, and changing it regularly was considered the proper way to stay clean. A wealthy person demonstrated their cleanliness not by scrubbing their body, but by wearing fresh, clean linen close to the skin. On top of that came perfumes, scented oils, and pomanders, little containers of fragrant substances carried to mask unpleasant smells. You did not remove the odor so much as negotiate with it, layering pleasant scents over the human reality underneath. The result was a court that smelled, to put it charitably, complicated. Hundreds of people richly dressed, rarely fully washed, all doused in competing perfumes, gathered together in enclosed stone rooms. The air was a dense tapestry of floral scent, sweat, wood, smoke, cooking, and the general human funk of a crowd. Everyone was in the same situation, which meant nobody could point fingers, and the shared nose blindness of the era did the rest. You would adjust quickly, as everyone did, and stop noticing what would knock a modern visitor flat on arrival. And then there were your teeth, the quiet casualty of royal wealth. Sugar was a luxury, a mark of status, and the rich consumed it with enthusiasm in sweets and elaborate confections. The result was widespread tooth decay among exactly the people who could afford the most sugar. Your dazzling royal smile framed by all that careful beauty work might well be darkened by decay, because the very richness of your diet was rotting it away. It is perfect little emblem of the whole business really. The higher you rose, the sweeter your food and the browner your smile. You're pampered, perfumed, poisoned, and gently decaying, and it is not even lunchtime yet, which is fortunate because lunch, as it turns out, is its own spectacle entirely. It is time to eat, and royal feasts are magnificent, exhausting affairs. Course after course arrives. Roasted meats, game birds, spiced dishes, elaborate sugar sculptures, and pastries shaped like castles, all designed to broadcast the king's wealth to everyone in the room. What you will not find much of are vegetables, because greenery is considered peasant food, and certainly no potatoes since they have barely arrived in Europe. You eat rich, heavy, meat-drenched meals night after night, which is delightful for the first week and slowly ruinous for your digestion. And because the king is famously suspicious, your food is watched, tasted, and guarded. A queen never simply enjoys a meal. She performs one gracefully while quietly wondering if tonight is the night someone decides to season her wine with something extra. Let us start with the sheer scale of it. A royal feast was not dinner in any sense you would recognize. It was a display, a piece of theater designed to overwhelm. Dozens of dishes might be presented in successive courses. Groaning platters of roasted beef, venison, swan, peacock, and whatever else could be hunted, cooked, and arranged impressively on a table. The point was excess. A king proved his power by showing that he could command more food than any sane household could eat, and then serve it on gold and silver in front of an audience that would spread word of his magnificence. The star of the table was meat, and lots of it. Wealth was expressed through flesh. The richer and rarer the better. Great joints of roasted animals spiced and sourced dominated the meal because diet heavy in meat announced that you were far above the common folk who survived on bread and pottage. Vegetables, by contrast, were viewed with a certain snobbery, associated with the poor and the earthy, and therefore rather beneath a royal palate. So you dined on animal after animal, night after night, in a manner that was undeniably luxurious and quietly catastrophic for the human digestive system. Spices were another way to flaunt your status, since they arrived from far away at enormous cost. A heavily spiced dish was a boast made edible. Each expensive grain of pepper or pinch of exotic seasoning quietly announcing how much money had been poured onto the plate. Sweet confections and elaborate sugar sculptures did similar work, showing off a commodity so precious that turning it into decorative art was itself a flex. Your feast was in effect the king's wealth rendered in gravy and sugar, consumed in public for maximum effect. But you cannot simply relax and enjoy the abundance because the king's suspicion follows him even to the dinner table. Poison was a genuine fear for powerful people, and elaborate precautions surrounded royal food. Dishes could be tasted before they reached the king to guard against foul play, and the whole apparatus of the kitchens operated under watchful eyes. As his wife, you exist within that same climate of weariness. Every meal carries a faint undercurrent of threat, a quiet awareness that food is not just nourishment, but a possible weapon in a court full of people with motives. So you eat gracefully, mindful of your manners, mindful of who is watching, and mindful that dining beside the most suspicious man in England is never entirely without risk. The feast is glorious and heavy and endless, a nightly monument to power that leaves you overfed and faintly uneasy. And when the last sugar castle has been admired and the platters cleared away, the true purpose of your entire existence at court settles back onto your shoulders, heavier than any meal. Because pleasant as the banquet was, it was never the thing that mattered. This was here. It is the beating anxious heart of your entire existence as a Tudor wife, the male heir. Everything else, your charm, your intelligence, your beauty, your loyalty is background noise compared to this single brutal demand. Henry needs a son. England, he believes, needs a son. Without one, he is convinced the kingdom will collapse into chaos the moment he dies. And so your body becomes public property, the subject of prayers, gossip, and royal impatience. Daughters, however healthy and brilliant, are treated as near failures. Catherine of Aragon gave him a daughter and endless heartbreak. And Boleyn gave him a daughter who had become one of the greatest monarchs in history. And it still was not enough to save her. The pressure is enormous, unfair, and completely beyond your control. To understand the obsession, you have to understand Henry's fear. England had not long emerged from decades of vicious civil war fought over the succession. The long and bloody conflict remembered as the Wars of the Roses. To Henry, a strong undisputed male heir was the only thing standing between his dynasty and a return to that chaos. A daughter, in his mind, could not secure the throne the way a son could, because a female ruler was seen as vulnerable, disputable, and likely to drag the realm back into conflict. So, the son was not a preference. It was to him a matter of national survival. This turned your body into a subject of relentless public interest. Your pregnancies, or lack of them, were tracked, discussed, and prayed over by the entire court. Ambassadors reported on your condition to foreign powers. Physicians and astrologers offered predictions. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had a stake. And everyone watched. Imagine your most private biological processes being treated as headline news across an entire continent with kings and popes awaiting the outcome. That was your reality, and there was no escaping the scrutiny. The cruelty was that the one thing demanded of you was the one thing you could not command. Whether you conceived, whether the pregnancy held, and above all, whether the child was a boy were matters of chance that no queen could control by effort or virtue. And yet you were held responsible as though you could. A daughter was received with barely concealed disappointment, a miscarriage with something closer to alarm. You were being judged on a lottery, and the failure to win it was treated as a personal, almost moral shortcoming. The examples around you told the whole grim story. Catherine of Aragon endured pregnancy after pregnancy, suffered heartbreaking losses, and produced a healthy daughter in Mary, and still it was deemed a failure worth ending a 20-year marriage over. And Boleyn gave Henry a daughter named Elizabeth, a child who would one day become one of the most celebrated monarchs England ever knew. And even that extraordinary daughter could not protect her mother from the block. If the future Elizabeth I was not enough, then no daughter ever could be. So you carry this pressure everywhere, a constant weight beneath the jewels and the fine gowns. You're surrounded by luxury, and yet reduced in the eyes of the men who rule your fate to a single function. Your value rises and falls with the contents of your womb, a thing you cannot govern and dare not fail at. It is the loneliest kind of pressure because no one can share it and nothing can relieve it. And when hope finally arrives in the form of a pregnancy, it brings not peace, but a whole new season of fear. So you're expecting, which brings joy, relief, and a fresh wave of terror. Pregnancy at court is a strange mix of celebration and superstition. You will be fussed over, prayed over, and warned away from anything believed to harm the baby, which included a long and often bizarre list of foods, sights, and activities. There are no scans, no reliable medicine, and no way of knowing if the child is a longed-for boy until the very end. Everyone around you is quietly hoping, and that hope presses down on you like a second heavier gown. You carry not just a child but the expectations of an entire kingdom, all while dealing with the ordinary miseries of pregnancy and the extraordinary knowledge that the outcome could decide whether you rise or fall. The first thing to understand is how little anyone actually knew. There was no way to confirm a pregnancy early, no way to monitor the baby's health, and certainly no way to determine whether you carried a boy or a girl until the moment of birth. Pregnancy was a long walk through fog. You waited, you hoped, you watched your own body for signs, and you had no reliable knowledge of what was truly happening inside you. In a world so desperate for a male heir, this uncertainty was its own quiet torment, a question that could not be answered for many long months. Into that gap of knowledge poured an ocean of superstition and advice. Expectant mothers were surrounded by beliefs about what might harm or shape the child. Certain foods were encouraged, others forbidden. There were notions that a frightening sight or a strong emotion could mark the baby, that the mother's experiences might imprint themselves on the child in the womb. Much of this was folklore rather than medicine, but it was taken seriously, and it meant your daily life was hedged about with rules and warnings from every side. You were also fussed over in ways both kind and suffocating. A pregnant queen was precious cargo, and everyone had an interest in the outcome. You would be watched, tended, advised, and cautioned constantly. Rest was encouraged, activity was restricted, and the whole household orbited around the pregnancy. It might sound pleasant to be so cared for, but there is a heavy difference between being cherished and being managed. You were the vessel of the succession, and you were treated accordingly with an attention that had as much to do with the child's importance as with your own comfort. Meanwhile, you still had to endure all the ordinary difficulties of pregnancy, the sickness, the exhaustion, the aches, the strain, but without any of the modern comforts or reassurances that ease the experience today. There were no scans to reassure you that all was well, no reliable medicine for the discomforts, no clear understanding of what was normal and what was cause for alarm. You simply carried on, enduring the physical toll while shouldering the emotional weight of everyone's hopes, one uncertain day at a time. And beneath it all ran the sharpest fear of all, the knowledge that everything depended on the outcome. A healthy son would secure your place and lift you higher than ever. A daughter would bring disappointment, and a loss could be catastrophic to your standing. So your pregnancy was never a private joyful anticipation. It was a public trial with the highest possible stakes conducted in an atmosphere of hope thick enough to choke on. And however anxious those months of waiting were, they were only the prelude to the single most dangerous day of your life. Now comes the most dangerous day of your life. And I mean that literally. When your time arrives, you're ushered into a sealed, darkened room known as the groaning chamber. Sometimes with the windows covered to keep out light and fresh air, because that was thought to be safer. There are no doctors as we know them, only midwives, prayers, and a great deal of hope. Pain relief does not exist. Infection is a constant lurking threat. Childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women of every rank, and being a queen bought you comfort, not safety. You endure it because you must grip in the hands of your ladies. And if both you and the child survive, that alone is a genuine triumph. Jane Seymour gave Henry his precious son, and did not live to see him grow. The setting itself would unsettle a modern mind. As the birth approached, a queen would withdraw into confinement, retreating into a chamber prepared specially for the event. The room was often kept dark, with windows covered and warmth carefully maintained, because the prevailing belief held that fresh air and light might be harmful during this delicate time. Away from the male world of the court, surrounded only by women, you entered a kind of sealed sanctuary that was equal parts refuge and pressure chamber. It was meant to protect you. It also isolated you completely at the most frightening moment imaginable. Within that room, your attendants were midwives and your own ladies, not physicians in any sense we would recognize. Medical understanding of childbirth was limited, and the tools available were prayer, experience, and whatever practical skill the midwife possessed. There was no meaningful pain relief. So you faced the full agony of labor with nothing but the grip of loyal hands and the murmured comfort of the women around you. It was endurance in its rawest form, a trial of the body with no shortcut and no mercy, faced by queen and commoner alike. The dangers were terrifyingly real and largely beyond anyone's power to prevent. Complications that a modern hospital handles routinely could be fatal in the Tudor world. Infection following childbirth was a common and deadly threat, striking even when the birth itself had seemed to go well. Bleeding, difficult labors, and countless other complications claimed the lives of women at every level of society. Being a queen meant you had the finest linens, the warmest room, and the most devoted attendants. But none of that could shield you from the fundamental peril of the act itself. Comfort, yes. Safety, no. The most heartbreaking proof of this was Jane Seymour. She achieved the very thing that had eluded and doomed the wives before her, delivering Henry a healthy son, the longed-for male heir who would become Edward V/6. In the eyes of the court, she had triumphed completely, succeeding where others had catastrophically failed, and then within days she died, most likely from complications following the birth. She won the impossible prize and did not live to enjoy it. If ever there was a lesson that success itself could not save you, Jane's fate was it. So you go into that darkened room knowing all of this. Knowing that the day meant to bring new life is also the day most likely to end yours. You endure the pain. You cling to the hands offered to you. And you pray as everyone around you prays that both you and the child will see the morning. If you both survive, it is a genuine victory, a small miracle wrung from a brutal ordeal. But childbirth did not always end in triumph, and the losses it brought carried a special cruelty all their own, because in this world even grief was not allowed to be simple. Let us talk about heartbreak, because in this marriage even grief is political. If you miss Ari, and many royal women did repeatedly, it is not treated as the private tragedy it is. It is treated as a failure, a bad omen, possibly even a sign of divine displeasure. Henry took his wife's losses personally, as though their bodies were deliberately betraying him. And Boleyn's miscarriage of a son came at a devastating moment and helped seal her doom. There is no compassion built into the system, no space to simply mourn. Instead, you must recover quickly, reassure the king, and promise that next time will be different, all while your enemies whisper that perhaps you are cursed, unworthy, or worse. Losing a child was agony. Being blamed for it was salt in an already fatal wound. Miscarriage was tragically common in an age with no understanding of the causes and no means of prevention. Royal women endured it again and again, each loss a private devastation. But you were not permitted the privacy to grieve because your pregnancies belonged in a sense to the whole kingdom. When hoped-for heir slipped away, it was not treated as the personal sorrow of a woman who'd lost a child. It was treated as a political event, a setback in the great national project of securing the succession, and therefore everybody's business. Worse still, in a deeply religious age, misfortune was often read as a message. A miscarriage could be whispered about as a sign of God's displeasure, a hint that something was wrong with the marriage itself or with the woman. Henry was especially prone to this kind of thinking. When his unions failed to produce living sons, he was capable of convincing himself that the fault lay in some divine judgment against the marriage. A conviction that had already helped him justify casting off Catherine of Aragon. A single loss could therefore be spun into evidence that your entire marriage was cursed. And Boleyn's story shows how deadly this logic could become. She suffered the loss of a child, reportedly a son, at a critical moment when her position was already weakening, and Henry's affections were already drifting. In a court hungry for reasons to bring her down. That loss became one more brick in the wall being built against her. Her grief was not met with tenderness. It was folded into the case for her destruction, treated as further proof that she had failed in her one essential duty. Her body's misfortune was used as ammunition, and through all of this, you were expected to bear it with composure and bounce back quickly. There was no room for a prolonged mourning, no acknowledgement that you had suffered something profound and painful. Instead, you had to recover, reassure your husband, and turn your face once more toward the demand for an heir, promising that the next attempt would succeed. You carried your private heartbreak silently, while performing hope for the benefit of a king and a court that saw your loss primarily as an inconvenience. Meanwhile, your enemies made full use of it. Any weakness in your position was an opportunity for rival factions, and a run of misfortune in the birthing chamber was a gift to those who wished to see you replaced. They would whisper that you were unworthy, unlucky, perhaps even under a curse, sharpening every loss into a weapon against you. So grief itself became dangerous. You could not simply mourn. You had to survive the mourning politically as well as emotionally. It was a cruelty layered upon a tragedy. And the people watching most closely, the ones perfectly placed to profit from your sorrow, were often the very women who dressed you every morning. Every queen is surrounded by ladies in waiting. Elegant, well-born women who dress you, entertain you, and keep you company. They are your closest companions, and they are also potentially your replacements. This is the cruel little secret of court. Henry had a habit of finding his next wife among the attendants of his current one. And Boleyn served Catherine of Aragon. Jane Seymour served in Boleyn. The pattern was less a coincidence and more a revolving door. So there you sit, chatting and laughing with the very women who might one day step into your crown, possibly while it is still warm. You must be warm and gracious because coldness invites gossip. Yet you can never fully relax, because kindness and betrayal often wore the same beautiful face at Henry's court. First, understand what these women actually were. Ladies-in-waiting were not servants in the ordinary sense. They were gentle women of good family, often from powerful households who attended the queen as companions and helpers. They dressed you, accompanied you, entertained you, and formed the intimate circle of your daily life. To be a lady-in-waiting to the queen was a position of honor and opportunity, a foot in the door at the very center of power. Ambitious families placed their daughters in these roles precisely because proximity to the crown was the surest route to advancement, and proximity to the crown in Henry's court meant proximity to Henry. This is where the arrangement turned quietly sinister. The queen's attendants were young, poised, carefully chosen for their grace and appeal, and they moved constantly within the king's orbit. It was, in effect, a gathering of exactly the sort of women who might catch a wandering royal eye. The very qualities that made a good lady-in-waiting also made her a potential rival to the woman she served. Your household was staffed in a sense with your possible successes. The historical pattern is almost too neat to believe. And Boleyn first came to prominence as a lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon, and it was in that role that she captured Henry's attention and eventually Catherine's crown. Then Jane Seymour served as a lady-in-waiting to in Boleyn, and it was from that same position of intimate proximity that she drew Henry's eye and eventually replaced Anne. Twice the crown passed from a queen to one of her own attendants. This was not random misfortune. It was a structural feature of a court where the king chose his wives from the women closest at hand. So consider your position. You're surrounded every single day by charming, well-born women, any one of whom might follow the well-worn path from attendant to queen. You laugh with them, confide in them, perhaps rely on them for the intimate business of your daily life, and yet you can never entirely trust that one of them is not even now being noticed. The warmth between you might be genuine, or it might be the polite surface over ambition. In this court, the two are nearly impossible to tell apart. You cannot simply hold them all at arm's length, either, because a cold and suspicious queen invites her own kind of trouble. Aloofness breeds resentment and gossip at this court could be lethal. So you must be gracious, generous, and companionable, all while carrying the private knowledge that any of these smiling faces could one day wear your jewels. It is an exhausting way to live, forever warm on the outside and watchful underneath. And the watchfulness, it turns out, was entirely justified, because the greatest danger of all sat across from you at every meal in the person of your own unpredictable husband. Now we must discuss your husband's temper, which was legendary and utterly unpredictable. In his younger years, Henry was athletic, witty, and generous, a genuine catch by the standards of the age. But as time and disappointment wore on him, he grew suspicious, self-pitying, and prone to towering rages. Affection could curdle into cold fury with terrifying speed. A man who adored you on Monday might be listening to whispers against you by Friday. Loyalty offered no protection, and neither did love, because Henry had a remarkable talent for convincing himself that whatever he wanted was also what God in England wanted. Living with him meant reading his moods like a sailor reads the sky, always watching for the darkening clouds that meant someone, possibly you, was about to be caught in the storm. It is worth remembering that Henry was not always the tyrant of legend. In his youth he was genuinely impressive, a tall, handsome, gifted prince who excelled at sport, music, and learning, and who charmed nearly everyone he met. The young Henry was the golden hope of England, admired across Europe, generous to those in his favor, and dazzling company. This matters because it means his wives were not marrying a monster. They were marrying a man who could be wonderful, which made the darkness that followed all the more disorienting when it arrived. But the years were not kind to his character. Disappointment after disappointment, the lack of a son, the betrayals he perceived everywhere, the pain of his declining health, all worked on him like acid. He grew increasingly suspicious, quick to feel wronged, and prone to bouts of furious anger. The generous prince curdled into a self-pitying and dangerous king, who could nurse grievances and lash out with devastating consequences. The man got harder and colder as he aged, and the people around him learned to tread carefully. The truly frightening thing was the speed with which his feelings could reverse. Henry's affection was intense but unstable, and it could turn to suspicion or fury with alarming quickness. A wife or courtier basking in royal favor one week might find themselves under a cloud the next, undone by rumor, jealousy, or the king's shifting whims. There was no reliable safe harbor because the weather of his moods changed without warning. You could do everything right and still find the warmth withdrawn, replaced by a coldness that carried real menace. What made this doubly dangerous was Henry's gift for self-justification. He possessed a remarkable ability to convince himself that his desires were righteous, that whatever he wanted was also the will of God and the good of England. When he tired of a wife, he did not simply admit to changing his mind. He found reasons, often religious or legal, to believe that the marriage had been wrong all along. This meant his cruelty rarely felt like cruelty to him. It felt like justice, which made it impossible to argue against and terrifying to be on the wrong side of. So life beside him became an endless exercise in vigilance. You learned to read his expressions, to sense the shift in the room, to notice when the mood was darkening before the storm actually broke. You measured your words, watched for warning signs, and tried always to stay on the sunlit side of his temperament. It was exhausting and precarious, a marriage conducted like a careful negotiation with an unpredictable force of nature, and as if his moods were not challenged enough, the man himself was changing in ways that made devotion an increasingly demanding performance. Let us gently address the physical reality of your beloved husband. The dashing young prince of the early years did not last. After a serious jousting accident in 1536, Henry's health declined dramatically. He grew enormously overweight, his waist eventually measuring well over 50 in, and he developed a chronic ulcer on his leg that oozed, stank, and caused him constant pain. This did wonders for his already delightful mood. You are expected to be devoted, attentive, and affectionate toward a man who is often in agony, frequently furious, and to put it kindly, no longer the vision of romance he once was. Being queen means smiling warmly at a suffering short-tempered giant with a wound you can smell from across the room. Marriage, they said. It will be lovely, they said. The turning point was dramatic and specific. In 1536, Henry suffered a serious accident while jousting, a sport he had once dominated. The injury was severe, and it seems to have marked the beginning of a steep physical decline. The active, athletic king, who had thrilled the court with his prowess, was gradually replaced by a man whose body was failing him. From that point forward, the Golden Prince receded into memory, and the ailing, heavy monarch of his later years began to take his place. The change in his size was extraordinary. Henry, once celebrated for his fine physique, ballooned in his later years until his waist measured somewhere well over 50 inches. His armor from different periods of his life tells the story plainly. A young man of impressive build slowly becoming an enormous one. His mobility suffered, his appearance transformed, and the vigorous king of legend became a vast figure who required considerable assistance simply to move about. The decline was visible to everyone, though of course no one dared comment. Then there was the leg. Henry developed chronic ulcers, painful open wounds that would not heal and that plagued him for years. These sores could become infected. They oozed unpleasantly, and by many accounts they produced a foul smell that lingered around him. The pain was frequently severe, a constant grinding misery that no medicine of the age could truly relieve. Imagine living with an untreatable, agonizing mellitorous wound for years on end, and you begin to understand why the king's temper only worsened with time. Chronic pain is not known for improving anyone's disposition, and you, as his wife, were expected to be lovingly attentive through all of it. Your role demanded devotion, warmth, and care toward a husband who was often suffering, frequently irritable, and physically transformed from the man the songs remembered. You were to be affectionate toward a giant in constant pain, patient with his foul moods, and tender toward a body that was, frankly, in a distressing state. There was no room for visible reluctance. A queen who seemed anything less than devoted would be noticed, and being noticed for the wrong reasons at Henry's court was never wise. This was the particular burden of the later wives, especially women like Catherine Parr, who came to Henry when he was already ailing and difficult. They served as much as nurse and companion as bride, tending a sick and volatile king, while maintaining the careful performance of a loving wife. It was a role that demanded enormous patience, self-control, and stamina, all while walking the usual tightrope of court politics. Devotion to Henry in his decline was not romance. It was labor, and dangerous labor at that. And the danger did not come only from the king himself, but from the whole seething world of the court that surrounded you both. The Tudor Court was not one happy household. It was a nest of rival families, ambitious nobles, and scheming advisors, all jostling for the king's favor, and all perfectly willing to destroy one another to get it. As queen, you are not above this game. You are the biggest prize on the board. Your rise lifts your family and allies, and your fall drags them down, which means powerful people have staked everything on you, and other powerful people would love to see you ruined. Factions form around religion, around foreign policy, around who whispered what into the king's ear last night. You must build allies, reward loyalty, and watch your back constantly. Because in this world, A friend is simply an enemy who has not yet found a better opportunity. At its heart, the court was a machine for competition. Great families and ambitious men gathered around the king because he was the source of all power, all wealth, and all advancement. Titles, lands, offices, and influence flowed from royal favor, and so everyone of consequence fought subtly or openly to secure more of it. This competition never stopped. It ran beneath every banquet, every ceremony, every polite conversation, a constant, quiet struggle for position that shaped everything and everyone at court, including you. Your marriage placed you directly at the center of this struggle, whether you wished it or not. A queen was not a neutral figure floating above the fray. She was the ultimate prize and the ultimate lever. When a woman rose to become Henry's wife, her entire family rose with her, gaining offices, honors, and influence. The barons climbed on Anne's rise, the Seymours on Jane's. This meant that your success was the success of a whole faction. And your enemies were not just your enemies, but the enemies of everyone who had bet on you. The factions themselves formed around the great questions of the day. Religion was the sharpest dividing line, separating those who clung to the old Catholic ways from those who favored the new reforms. And a queen's leanings on this question signaled which camp she strengthened. Foreign policy created further divisions as different families favored alliances with different European powers. And beneath these grand issues ran the endless petty warfare of personal ambition, the daily struggle over who stood closest to the king and who had his ear. You were a piece in all of these games at once. This meant your position depended on more than the king's affection. It depended on the network of allies you could build and hold. A wise queen cultivated friends, rewarded loyalty, and placed trusted people in useful positions, building a base of support that could help protect her. But every ally gained was a signal to rival factions, and every act of favor created resentment somewhere else. Building your strength and painting a target on your back were frustratingly often the very same action. There was no way to be powerful at court without also becoming a threat to someone. And so you learned to live in a state of perpetual watchfulness, constantly assessing who could be trusted, who was rising, who was falling, and who might be quietly working against you. Alliances shifted, loyalties were bought and sold, and today's friend could become tomorrow's accuser if the winds of favor changed direction. It was a world where trust was a luxury and vigilance was survival. And the deadliest weapon in this endless war was not the sword or the poison cup. It was information gathered patiently, whispered carefully, and wielded with lethal precision by those who knew exactly how to use it. In case the factions were not exhausting enough, know this. Someone is always watching you. The court ran on gossip, and information was the most valuable currency of all. Servants could be bribed, ladies could be turned, and a single careless comment could be twisted into treason. Thomas Cromwell, the king's ruthless fixer, was a master of gathering whispers and shaping them into weapons, and he helped bring down more than one queen with exactly this method. So you learn to guard every word, every glance, every letter because anything you say might be repeated, exaggerated, and eventually read aloud at a trial where you are the accused. Imagine living your entire life knowing the walls have ears, the servants have loyalties, and your own words could one day be used to measure your neck for the block. Information was the true currency of the Tudor Court, more valuable in its way than gold. To know something before your rivals did, to understand what the king was thinking, to catch a hint of a shifting alliance or a fading favorite was to hold power. And so the whole court operated as a vast humming engine of observation and gossip. Everyone watched everyone. Every conversation might be reported, every friendship noted, every change in mood analyzed for meaning. In such an environment, privacy was not merely rare. It was essentially impossible. The people best placed to gather this information were the ones who moved unnoticed through your daily life. Servants saw everything and could be bribed or pressured into repeating what they saw. Ladies-in-waiting, intimate with your private moments, could be turned by rival factions or by their own ambition. The very people closest to you, the ones you relied on for the smallest daily tasks, were potential sources of intelligence for anyone who wished you harm. You were surrounded at all times by ears that might belong ultimately to someone else. No one embodied the danger better than Thomas Cromwell. Henry's brilliant and ruthless minister was a master of this shadow world, skilled at collecting rumors, extracting statements, and assembling scattered fragments into damning cases. When the king wished to be rid of a wife, it was often Cromwell who did the quiet work of building the accusation, gathering the whispers and the coerced testimony that could be dressed up as evidence. He helped engineer the downfall of more than one of Henry's queens, proving just how lethal well-organized gossip could become in the right hands. This meant that your own words were a permanent hazard. A careless remark, an idle complaint, a flirtatious pleasantry meant as mere courtesy. Any of these could be remembered, repeated, and twisted into something sinister. In the atmosphere of Henry's court, an innocent comment could be reshaped into evidence of disloyalty or worse. And once such a thing began to take shape, denying it was nearly impossible. You had to assume that anything you said might one day be repeated in the worst possible light before the worst possible audience. So you learned an exhausting and unnatural discipline, guarding not only your speech, but your expressions, your letters, and even your friendships. Every word was chosen with care, every glance considered, every written line composed as though it might one day be read by your enemies, because it very well might. To live this way in permanent self-surveillance was a strain almost impossible to imagine. A life without a single truly safe or private moment. And the terrible irony was that even the most careful guarding of your tongue might not save you, because in the deadliest disputes at court, the truth was rarely what mattered most. What mattered was faith, and faith in Henry's England had become the most dangerous subject of all. Faith at Henry's court was not a peaceful personal matter. It was a minefield. Henry famously broke with the Pope in Rome so he could annul his first marriage, making himself head of the new Church of England, which turned religion into a life or death question of loyalty. Lean too far toward the old Catholic ways, and you might be seen as siding with his enemies. Lean too far toward reform, and you might be branded a dangerous radical. The safe position kept shifting depending on Henry's mood, his current wife, and his political needs that week. As queen, your beliefs are watched closely, because they signal which faction you favor. Catherine Parr nearly lost everything for holding reformist views a little too openly. In Tudor, England, choosing your prayers was as risky as choosing your friends. To understand the danger, you must understand the break itself. When the Pope refused to grant Henry the annulment he craved from Catherine of Aragon, Henry did something extraordinary. He severed England's connection to Rome and declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. This was not a quiet theological adjustment. It was a seismic upheaval that tore the country away from centuries of religious tradition and placed the king himself at the summit of the church. In one stroke, loyalty to God and loyalty to Henry became tangled together in a way that made faith intensely political. This turned religious belief into a test of allegiance. To cling to the old Catholic ways with their loyalty to Rome could be read as sympathy for the Pope and thus for Henry's enemies. To embrace the new reforms too eagerly could mark you as a radical, pushing changes further than the king himself wished to go. There was a narrow band of acceptable belief, and staying within it required constant attention, because the king's own religious position was neither simple nor fixed. Henry broke with Rome, but kept much of traditional doctrine, occupying a shifting middle ground that others had to anxiously mirror. And that middle ground moved. What counted as safe orthodoxy could change depending on the political needs of the moment, the influence of whichever faction was ascendant, and the leanings of Henry's current wife. A position that was acceptable one year might become suspect the next. People were executed under Henry for being too Catholic and others for being too Protestant, sometimes in overlapping periods, which tells you everything about how treacherous the ground truly was. You could be devout and sincere and still find yourself on the wrong side of a line that had quietly shifted beneath your feet. As queen, your own beliefs were watched with particular intensity because they carried enormous symbolic weight. A queen's religious leaning signaled which faction she favored and which direction she might nudge the king. This made your faith a matter of public and political concern, not private conscience. Your prayers, your reading, your chaplain, and your patronage were all noted and interpreted. To hold strong views was to make yourself a banner for one side and a target for the other in a conflict where the losers did not merely lose arguments. Catherine P. learned this the hard way. Her reformist sympathies, expressed a little too openly for comfort, gave her enemies the opening they needed, and a warrant for her arrest was actually drawn up. She survived only by quick thinking and careful submission, a story we will come to in full. Her narrow escape stands as proof that even a queen could be undone by her beliefs. So you guarded your faith as carefully as your words, understanding that the wrong prayer could be as fatal as the wrong lover. And if you wanted to know how a queen truly fell, you had only to look back at the woman who wore the crown first. To understand your future, you must understand your predecessors, and the first of them casts a very long shadow. Catherine of Aragon was Henry's first wife, a proud Spanish princess who had once been married to his late brother. She was dignified, deeply loved by the English people, and married to Henry for over 2 decades. Her only crime was failing to give him a surviving son, and for that Henry tore the country away from Rome to be rid of her. She refused to go quietly, insisting to her dying day that she was his true and lawful wife. She was cast aside, separated from her beloved daughter, and left to die in cold, lonely exile, divorced, discarded, but never entirely defeated. Her stubborn dignity haunted Henry, and it should haunt you, too. Catherine's story began in grandeur. She was a daughter of the powerful Spanish monarchs, a princess of impeccable royal blood, and she first came to England to marry Henry's older brother, Arthur. When Arthur died young, she eventually married Henry instead, a union that required special dispensation from the Pope, precisely because she had been wed to his brother. For years, this marriage was celebrated and secure. Catherine was a respected queen, learned and pious, and for a long time genuinely loved by Henry, who valued her counsel and her royal standing. She was also deeply beloved by the English people, and this mattered enormously. Catherine carried herself with the dignity that won admiration across the realm. She was seen as devout, gracious, and truly royal, the very model of what a queen should be. This popular affection never faded, even as Henry turned against her, and it made the king's campaign to discard her far more difficult and far more scandalous. To cast aside such a queen was to defy not only the church, but the sympathies of much of the nation. Her tragedy was that she could not give Henry the surviving son he demanded. She endured many pregnancies and heartbreaking losses, and produced a healthy daughter Mary who would herself one day rule. But a daughter was not enough for Henry, obsessed as he was with a male heir. And so after more than 2 decades of marriage, he set out to be rid of her, convincing himself that their union had been sinful all along because of her prior marriage to his brother. This conviction became the engine that drove England's break with Rome. Catherine, however, refused to surrender her position. She insisted with unshakable firmness that she was Henry's true and lawful wife and that her marriage was valid in the eyes of God. She would not accept an annulment, would not retire quietly to a convent, would not grant Henry the easy exit he wanted. Her resistance was formidable and principled, and it frustrated the king enormously. She fought for her marriage and her daughter's legitimacy with a courage that never wavered, even as the full power of the crown was turned against her. Her reward for this steadfastness was a cruel and lonely end. She was separated from Henry, stripped of her status as queen, kept away from her beloved daughter Mary, and confined in increasingly grim and isolated circumstances. She died in exile from the court she'd once graced, still insisting on her rights, still writing to Henry as his true wife. Divorced and discarded, yes, but never broken in spirit. Her dignity and defeat haunted Henry and lingered over the court for years. She was the first cautionary tale, but she was not the most terrifying. That grim honor belonged to the woman who replaced her. If Catherine's fate was tragic, the second wife's was terrifying. And was clever, bold, and magnetic. The woman for whom Henry moved heaven, earth, and an entire church. She captivated him for years, became queen, and gave him a daughter, the future Elizabeth I. And then it all collapsed. When and failed to produce a living son, and Henry's eye began to wander, her enemies struck. She was accused of adultery, incest, and treason. Charges built from thin air and coerced whispers. In May of 1536, she was beheaded within the walls of the Tower of London, executed by a swordsman brought specially from France. She went from the love of his life to a corpse in an arrow chest in a matter of years. Remember her name, and remember how quickly adoration can turn to an axe. And was unlike any woman the court had seen. Sharp-witted, sophisticated, and educated in the glittering courts of Europe, she carried herself with a confidence and style that set her apart from the gentle, obedient ladies around her. She was not a conventional beauty, but she was magnetic, commanding attention with her intelligence and spirit. It was this very quality that captivated Henry so completely, driving him to pursue her for years, and to overturn his entire world in order to marry her. For Anne, Henry defied the Pope, broke with Rome, and remade the religious life of an entire nation. For a time she stood at the very summit of her ambitions. She became queen, crowned in splendor. The woman who had achieved what seemed impossible. She reshaped the court, elevated her family, and wielded real influence at the king's side. And she gave Henry a child, a daughter named Elizabeth, who would grow up to become one of the greatest monarchs in English history. In that moment, and had won the dangerous game she had played so boldly, rising higher than almost any woman of her time could dream. But the same demand that doomed Catherine now closed in on Anne. Henry wanted a son, and Anne, after Elizabeth, could not give him a living one. She suffered a devastating loss at a critical moment, and as her failure to produce a male heir became apparent, Henry's passion began to cool. His eye wandered toward the quiet figure of Jane Seymour, and once the king's affection faltered, Anne's many enemies sensed that her hour of vulnerability had come. The court that had bent to accommodate her rise now turned hungrily toward her fall. The mechanism of her destruction was brutal and dishonest, and was accused of a shocking catalogue of crimes: adultery with several men, incest with her own brother, and treasonous conspiracy against the king. The charges were by any reasonable measure fabricated, riddled with contradictions, and built upon coerced statements, and courtly gossip twisted into evidence. But in Henry's court, when the king wanted a wife removed, the truth was whatever served his purpose. The trial was a grim performance with a verdict decided in advance. And so in May of 1536, and Boleyn was beheaded within the walls of the Tower of London. In a final gesture that passed for mercy, Henry arranged for an expert swordsman to be brought from France to carry out the execution swiftly and cleanly rather than by the coarser method of the axe. She met her death with remarkable composure and dignity. Buried hastily in an arrow chest for lack of a proper coffin, the woman who had once reshaped a kingdom was gone. She had been the love of Henry's life and became within a few short years a warning carved in blood. And the woman waiting to replace her was watching from the wings. Now consider the third wife and the strange lesson she teaches. Jane Seymour was everything and was not. Quiet, gentle, and soothingly obedient. Exactly the sort of calm devotion Henry claimed to want after all the drama. She did what none of the others managed. She gave him his longed-for son, the future Edward V/6. She should have been the great success story, the wife who finally won the impossible game. Instead, she died within days of the birth, most likely from complications and infection that Tudor medicine could do nothing about. Henry mourned her deeply, and later chose to be buried beside her. Her story is the cruelest twist of all. She succeeded completely at the one task that mattered, and it still cost her everything. Doing the right thing did not save you. Nothing reliably did. Jane presented a striking contrast to the woman she replaced. Where and had been bold, sharp, and dazzling, Jane was quiet, modest, and gentle, projecting an image of calm submission that Henry found deeply appealing after the storms of his second marriage. She was the picture of traditional wheelie virtue as the age understood it, soft-spoken and demure, seeming to promise peace and obedience rather than challenge and drama. To a king exhausted by conflict and eager to blame his troubles on the fiery end, Jane appeared to be the soothing answer to all his complaints. Their marriage followed with almost indecent speed after Anne's execution, and Jane settled into the role of the ideal Tudor queen. She was careful, gentle, and appropriately differential, avoiding the political boldness that had made Anne so many enemies. She seemed to understand exactly the part Henry wanted her to play, and she played it well. For a time all seemed calm, and Jane appeared to have found the safe and steady path through the perils that had destroyed the wives before her. Then she accomplished the one thing that had eluded and doomed both of her predecessors. She gave Henry a son. In October of 1537, she delivered a healthy boy, the prince who would one day reign as Edward V/6. This was the ultimate triumph, the fulfillment of the king's deepest and most desperate wish, the securing of the male succession that had driven him to overturn a marriage and remake a church. Jane had done it. She had won the impossible game, achieving the very thing for which Catherine had been cast off, and Anna had been destroyed, and it killed her. Within days of the birth, Jane fell ill, most likely from complications and infection following the delivery, and she died. The very act of producing the longed-for heir proved fatal. Tudor medicine, helpless against such dangers, could do nothing to save her. In the moment of her greatest success, at the peak of her value to Henry in the realm, she was gone. She never saw her son grow, never enjoyed the security her triumph should have earned her, never reaped any reward for having done what no other wife could. Henry mourned Jane genuinely and deeply, and in a telling gesture, he later chose to be buried beside her, treating her as the wife who had given him what mattered most. But her fate delivers the cruelest lesson of all. Jane did everything right. She was obedient. She avoided her predecessor's mistakes, and she succeeded completely at her one essential task. And still she did not survive. Her story proves that there was no reliable formula for safety in this marriage, no perfect performance that guaranteed a happy ending. Sometimes doing everything correctly simply led to a different kind of grave. And yet, remarkably, one wife did find a way to come out ahead, and her secret was the strangest of all. Let us lighten the mood with the wife who against all odds actually came out ahead. And of Cleves was a German noblewoman Henry agreed to marry largely for political reasons, having seen a flattering painted portrait of her beforehand. When she arrived in person, Henry decided the reality did not match the picture, and being Henry, he blamed her for it rather than his own expectations. He unkindly nicknamed her the Flanders mare. The marriage was never truly a marriage, and it was swiftly annulled. But here is the wonderful part. And agreed politely to the annulment, and in return Henry granted her castles, a generous income, and the honorary status of the king's beloved sister. She lived comfortably, wealthily, and safely, and she outlived every other wife. Sometimes the winning move is simply to be underestimated and let go. The marriage was arranged for reasons of diplomacy rather than desire. Following Jane Seymour's death, Henry's advisors, chiefly Thomas Cromwell, sought a foreign match that would strengthen England's position through alliance with the Protestant princes of the continent. And a noble woman from the German Duchy of Cleves fit this political purpose well. To help Henry assess his prospective bride from afar, the painter Hans Holbein was sent to produce a portrait of her, and the resulting image was, by all accounts, flattering. Henry, pleased with what he saw, agreed to the match. The trouble came when it arrived in the flesh. Henry, who had built up expectations based on the painting and his own imagination, was reportedly disappointed upon meeting her in person. Whatever the true reasons, and they may have owed as much to his own vanity and declining health as to and herself, the king decided he did not find her appealing. In his usual fashion, he laid the blame entirely on her rather than on his own inflated expectations, and the cruel nickname the Flanders May became attached to her, however unfairly. The marriage went ahead for the sake of the alliance, but it was a hollow arrangement from the start. By all accounts, it was never truly consummated, and Henry made little secret of his lack of enthusiasm. Before long, with the political reasons for the match fading, and Henry's eye already drawn elsewhere, he moved to have the marriage annulled. The lack of consummation provided convenient grounds, and the union was dissolved after only a matter of months. For any other wife, being cast off by Henry was a terrifying prospect, fraught with danger. But herein did something remarkably clever. Rather than resisting, protesting, or clinging to her position, as Catherine of Aragon had done, she agreed to the annulment gracefully and without a fuss. She cooperated fully, raised no objection, and made Henry's exit easy. This calm, sensible cooperation transformed her situation entirely. Instead of becoming an enemy to be destroyed, she became a problem pleasantly solved, and Henry, relieved and grateful, treated her with unexpected generosity. Her reward for this wisdom was extraordinary. Henry granted her a handsome settlement, including properties and a generous income, and bestowed upon her the honorary status of the king's beloved sister, giving her an esteemed and secure place at court. She lived out her days in comfort, wealth, and safety, free from the terror that had stalked the other wives. And in the final tally, she outlived every one of them, the divorced, the beheaded, and the one who died in childbirth alike. And of Cleves understood something the others could not always afford to grasp. That in this deadly game, being underestimated and quietly released was not defeat. It was survival and even victory. Not everyone, however, was granted the time or wisdom to play so shrewdly, as the next wife's brief and heartbreaking story shows. Then came the fifth wife, and one of the saddest stories of them all. Catherine Howard was very young, lively, and probably far too inexperienced for the venomous world she was thrust into. Henry, by now aging, ailing, and enormous, was besotted with his youthful new bride, and called her his rose without a thorn. But Catherine had a past, and worse, she had a present, with rumors of a romance conducted right under the court's watchful eyes. In a place ruled by spies and gossip, secrets like that could not survive. The accusations came, the evidence was gathered, and in 1542 she followed in Berlin to the block at the Tower. She was barely out of her teens. Her tragedy is a reminder that at Henry's court, youth and beauty were not protection. They were simply a shorter fuse. Catherine was strikingly young when she married the king. Little more than a girl thrust suddenly into the most dangerous position in the realm. She was lively, charming, and fond of pleasure with the natural high spirits of youth. But she lacked the political cunning, the caution, and the hard experience that survival at Henry's court demanded. She had not been raised for this role in the way a foreign princess might have been, and she was suddenly surrounded by intrigue, scrutiny, and lethal expectation for which nothing had prepared her. It was a perilous mismatch from the very beginning. Henry, by contrast, was in the twilight of his life, aging unwell, and vastly changed from the golden prince of his youth. Yet he was utterly delighted by his young bride, doting on her with the enthusiasm of a man recapturing something he had lost. He called her his rose without a thorn, a phrase dripping with tender illusion, and lavished attention and affection upon her. For a time Catherine seemed to bring the ailing king a burst of renewed happiness, and her position appeared bright, but Catherine carried a past that the venomous court would not let rest. Before her marriage, she had experiences and relationships that, in the merciless moral climate surrounding a queen, could be turned into weapons against her. And more dangerously still, there were rumors of a romance carried on during her marriage. Whispers of a relationship conducted within the very court that watched her every move. In a world where a queen's fidelity was bound up with the security of the succession, such rumors were not merely scandalous. They were potentially treasonous. In the atmosphere of Henry's court, where spies listened and gossip traveled like fire, such secrets had no hope of survival. Once suspicion was aroused, the machinery of investigation ground into motion. Statements were gathered. Connections were traced, and the case against her was assembled piece by piece. What might have been youthful folly in another life became, for a queen, a matter of state and a capital offense. The evidence mounted, and Catherine's brief moment of favor curdled into catastrophe with frightening speed. The end came swiftly and brutally. In 1542, Catherine Howard was executed at the Tower of London, following the same dreadful path that in Berlin had walked only a few years before. She was still barely out of her teens, a young woman destroyed by a game whose rules she had never fully understood and never had the chance to master. Her story is perhaps the most purely tragic of all, a reminder that at Henry's court neither youth nor beauty nor the king's infatuation offered any real protection. They simply meant the fall when it came was faster and more pitiful. And after such heartbreak, one might wonder whether anyone could possibly survive this marriage at all. Astonishingly, one woman did. Finally, we reached the sixth wife, the one who managed to do what 5 others could not: outlive him. Catherine P. was intelligent, well-educated, and already twice widowed when Henry chose her, making her more nurse and companion than blushing bride to the sick, difficult king. She was also a woman of strong reformist religious views, and that very nearly destroyed her. Her enemies convinced Henry to authorize her arrest, and the warrant was quite real. Catherine survived only by cleverly humbling herself before him, insisting she had merely debated religion to distract him from his pain, flattering his ego just enough to save her own neck. It worked barely. She survived the marriage, and after Henry died, she was finally free to marry for love. Even the great survivor spent her final married years one bad conversation away from the Tower. Catherine Parr came to a royal marriage as a mature and capable woman. Quite unlike the young brides who had preceded her in some cases, she was intelligent, notably well educated, and had already been widowed twice, giving her a wealth of experience and a steadiness of character. She was no naive girl dazzled by a crown. When Henry chose her, he was old, ailing, and difficult, and Catherine's role was as much that of nurse and companion as of wife. She tended to the suffering king with patience and skill, managing his moods and his ailments with a practiced, careful hand. She was also a woman of genuine intellect and strong convictions, particularly in matters of religion. Catherine held reformist beliefs and took a real interest in theological questions, even writing and promoting religious works. This was admirable. But in the deadly religious climate of Henry's court, it was also perilous. Her learning and her willingness to discuss and debate matters of faith made her conspicuous, and her leanings placed her firmly on one side of the great religious divide, giving her enemies a potential opening. That opening nearly proved fatal. Conservative factions at court, alarmed by her reformist views and eager to weaken her influence, worked to turn the king against her. They played on Henry's suspicions and his irritation, and they succeeded to a terrifying degree. A warrant was actually drawn up for Catherine's arrest. A very real document that could have led her down the same path as in Boleyn and Catherine Howard. For a moment, the great survivor stood at the very edge of the abyss that had swallowed others before her, but Catherine was clever, and her intelligence saved her life. Learning of the danger, she went to Henry and skillfully diffused the situation. She humbled herself before him, insisting that she had only raised religious topics in order to distract him from the pain of his ailments and to benefit from his superior wisdom, framing her debates as a wife's devoted attempt to comfort and learn from her husband. She flattered his ego, soothed his suspicions, and presented herself as submissive and adoring. Henry mlified, relented, and the danger passed. It was survival by the narrowest of margins, achieved through quick thinking and careful self-abasement rather than any real safety. Catherine went on to outlive Henry, the only one of his wives to do so as his widow, and after his death she was at last free to marry for love, which she did. She had won in a sense, escaping the marriage alive when 5 others had not. And yet even her victory carried the marriage's grim signature, for she had come within a signed warrant of destruction. Even the great survivor spent her final married years perpetually one misstep from the tower. And speaking of that tower, it is time to look properly at the shadow that fell across every one of these women. Let us take a slow, dreadful walk toward the place that looms over every wife's story, the Tower of London. In the popular imagination, it is a prison, but for a queen, it was something stranger and more sinister. Tradition held that monarchs and their consorts stayed in the royal apartments of the tower before a coronation, a place of honor and celebration. But those same walls also held the condemned. And Boleyn and Catherine Howard both entered the tower and never left it alive. So the tower carried a horrible double meaning. To arrive there in triumph was glorious. To be escorted there quietly without a crowd and without a coronation was the clearest possible sign that your story was ending. Every queen knew that the difference between a palace and a prison was sometimes only the reason you were brought inside. The tower was not, as many imagine, purely a grim dungeon. It was a sprawling royal fortress that served many purposes at once. It was a palace, a treasury, an armory, a menagerie, and yes, a prison, all contained within the same formidable walls. Kings and queens genuinely lodged there in comfort at certain times, occupying royal apartments fit for the highest in the land. The tower was a working part of the machinery of the monarchy, a place of power and ceremony as much as confinement. One of its most important ceremonial traditions concerned coronations. By custom, a consort would stay in the royal apartments of the tower before processing through the city to their coronation. To lodge in the tower in this context was a mark of the highest honor, a joyful prelude to the moment of crowning. A queen who entered the Tower for her coronation did so in triumph, surrounded by celebration at the very summit of her fortunes. In this sense, the Tower was a place of glory and beginnings, but the very same walls held a darker function, and the contrast could not have been more chilling. The Tower was also where the condemned were imprisoned. And in the case of the highest-ranking traitors, where they were executed within its precincts, prisoners awaited trial and sentence, and some met their deaths on the scaffold that stood inside. The Tower thus combined in a single place the heights of royal celebration and the depths of royal destruction. It was both the threshold of a crown and the antechamber of the grave. For Henry's queens, this double nature took on a terrible personal meaning. And Boleyn entered the Tower and did not leave it alive, executed within its walls in 1536. Catherine Howard suffered the same fate a few years later, imprisoned and then put to death in the same dreadful place. For these women, the Tower was not the joyful prelude to a coronation, but the final destination of a ruined queen. The building that had once symbolized the beginning of royal glory became for them the setting of its brutal end. So the Tower carried a meaning that every queen understood in her bones. To be brought there amid ceremony and celebration was the finest of honors. To be escorted there quietly, without a crowd, without a coronation waiting, was a sentence in itself, a sign that the story was drawing to its close. The same gates, the same stone chambers could mean either the crowning of a life or the ending of one. The difference lay only in why you had been brought inside, and the process that turned an honored queen into a condemned prisoner had its own grim and predictable shape. Now we face the machinery of the end. Because when Henry wanted to be rid of a wife, the law was simply a costume for his will. The charges were often spectacular. Adultery, incest, plotting against the king, treason. Itself and the trials that followed were grim performances with the verdict decided long before anyone spoke. Confessions were coaxed out under pressure. Witnesses were persuaded and contradictions were politely ignored. Once found guilty, a queen faced the ultimate mercy of her rank, a swift beheading rather than the horrors reserved for common traitors. And Boleyn was even granted an expert French swordsman for a cleaner death which passed for kindness in this world. Standing accused, you would defend yourself with all your intelligence and courage, and it would very likely make no difference at all. In Henry's court, justice was not blind. It simply looked wherever the king pointed. The charges leveled against a fallen queen were designed to be devastating. Accusations of adultery, incest, and conspiracy against the king's life carried the weight of treason, the gravest crime imaginable. These were not minor offenses, but capital charges that justified the ultimate penalty and painted the accused as a monstrous betrayer of both husband and realm. The very extravagance of the accusation served a purpose. Transforming a wife the king wished to discard into a dangerous criminal whose removal seemed not only justified but necessary for the safety of the kingdom. The trials that followed had the outward form of justice but little of its substance. They were in truth grim performances staged to give a predetermined outcome the appearance of legality. The verdict was effectively decided before the proceedings began, shaped by the king's will rather than by any honest weighing of evidence. Nobles and judges who owed their positions to Henry sat in judgment, fully aware of what was expected of them. To acquit a queen, the king wished condemned was simply not a realistic possibility. The evidence presented in these trials rarely bore close scrutiny. Confessions were extracted through pressure, coercion, and sometimes torture of those accused alongside the queen. Witnesses were persuaded or intimidated into providing damaging testimony. Dates and details that contradicted one another were quietly overlooked because coherence was not the point. The machinery existed to convict, not to discover truth. And inconvenient facts posed no obstacle to a process whose conclusion was already fixed. The whole apparatus was theater dressed in the solemn robes of the law. For the condemned queen, rank offered one final grim privilege. Rather than the horrifying deaths inflicted upon common traitors, a queen of the blood or by marriage was granted the relative mercy of beheading. A swift end befitting her station. In Anne Boleyn's case, this mercy was extended further still, with an expert swordsman summoned from France to ensure a clean and rapid death by a single stroke, spared the clumsiness of the axe. That such a thing counted as kindness tells you everything about the world these women inhabited. Mercy meant a faster death, not a spared life. And though the accused might defend herself with courage and skill, it changed nothing. A queen on trial could deny the charges with intelligence and dignity, could expose the contradictions in the evidence, could appeal to reason and to her own record of loyalty. And Boleyn defended herself with composure that impressed even her enemies, but eloquence could not overturn a verdict that had never truly been in doubt. The outcome was written before the first accusation was read aloud. In Henry's court, the law served the king's desires, and when he pointed at wife, the machinery did the rest. Which leaves us with the only question that ever really mattered for a wife of Henry VIII. So, how exactly do you survive being a wife of Henry VIII? The grim answer is that mostly you do not. The famous little rhyme sums up the fates of the six with brutal efficiency. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. 2 were cast aside, 2 were executed. 1 died bringing his heir into the world. And only 1 outlasted him. And even she came within a signature of disaster. To have any hope, you would need to give him a son. Avoid making enemies at a court built entirely on enemies. Guard every word against an army of spies. Keep your faith perfectly in step with his shifting whims. And somehow remain endlessly desirable to a suspicious aging king whose love had the emotional stability of a coin toss. You would need luck, cunning, patience, and nerves of pure steel. And even then, as 6 very different women learned, the safest place in Tudor England was as far from the king's affection as you could possibly get. Look at the odds laid out plainly, and they're genuinely staggering. Of the 6 women who married Henry, 2 had their marriages annulled and were cast aside. 2 were beheaded on charges built from thin air. 1 died from the complications of childbirth, and only 1 outlived him. That is a survival rate to make anyone shudder. The little rhyme that school children learn, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, is not merely a memory aid. It is a casualty list, a tidy summary of how dangerous it was to be loved by this particular king. And the requirements for survival were both impossible and contradictory. You needed to give Henry a son, a matter entirely beyond your control, dictated by chance and biology rather than effort. You needed to avoid making enemies in a court whose entire structure was built upon rivalry and ambition where your very success created foes. You needed to guard every word, every letter, and every glance against an army of watchers, ready to twist innocence into treason. Each demand alone was daunting. Together, they formed a test that no one could reliably pass. You would also need to navigate the deadly currents of faith, keeping your religious position perfectly aligned with a king whose own beliefs shifted according to mood and politics. Lean the wrong way, and you became a symbol for the losing side. And through all of this, you had to remain desirable and pleasing to an aging, ailing, suspicious man whose affection could evaporate without warning. His love was not a foundation to build upon. It was a coin spinning in the air, and your fate depended on how it landed. The women who navigated this best did so through a combination of luck and hard-won wisdom. And of Cleves survived and thrived by cooperating gracefully with her own dismissal, understanding that being let go was infinitely better than being fought over. Catherine P. survived by cleverly humbling herself at the crucial moment, soothing the king's suspicions with flattery and submission. The lesson buried in their stories is a dark one. The path to survival often lay not in winning Henry's heart, but in escaping it, in being released, overlooked, or gently set aside rather than clutched too tightly, because that was the final brutal truth of this marriage. The closer you stood to Henry's love, the greater your danger. The women who died were, in many cases, the ones he had wanted most fiercely. The women who survived were the ones who found a way out of the furnace of his affection. To be adored by Henry was to be placed on a pedestal at the edge of a cliff. So if you ever truly wanted to keep your head in every possible sense, the safest place to stand was not beside the king in glory, but as far from his restless, dangerous love as the walls of the kingdom would allow. It was a marriage where being wanted was the greatest peril of all, and being forgotten was a kind of mercy. And so, as the candles burn low and the great palace finally fall silent, we come to the end of your day as a wife of Henry VIII. What a day it was! You woke in a freezing stone chamber that watched your every move, were laced into a gown that fought you for each breath, painted your face with something close to poison, and smiled through a feast heavy enough to sink a ship. You carried the weight of a kingdom's expectations in your own body, endured the terror of the birthing chamber, and learned to guard every word against an army of listening ears. You lived beside a man whose love was as warm as summer and as sudden as an axe. Spare a thought tonight for the 6 real women who lived this story. Catherine, proud and cast aside. And, brilliant and betrayed. Jane, who won and lost in the very same breath. And of Cleves, wise enough to walk away. Young Catherine Howard gone far too soon. And Catherine Parr, who survived by the narrowest of margins. They were not just names in a rhyme. They were clever, frightened, hopeful, stubborn human beings who navigated an impossible world with courage we can scarcely imagine. Because history, for all its velvet and gold, was so often cruel to the people caught inside it. And yet they endured. They loved. They laughed. They fought for their place. And they left their mark on a kingdom that never quite deserved them. So tonight, as you settle into your own soft bed, safe, warm, and gloriously free to think and speak and simply be, whisper a quiet thank you to those who came before. Then let your shoulders soften. Let your breathing slow and drift gently off to sleep. You are safe. You are free. And your head, dear listener, is exactly where it should be.